Before we start, it's worth just trying to understand the UK tax system in terms of the basics of how it all works. That really drives how you need to analyse how to hold or invest in particular assets. Across the top we have this concept of domicile, so the blue boxes are someone who is UK domiciled and the green boxes are someone who is non-UK domiciled. Essentially domicile, well, I'll come on to explain domicile in a second, but then the second concept which drives the tax position is residency, and you'll see there in the blue box, excuse me, in the blue box you have a UK domiciled and UK resident individual and a UK domiciled and non-UK resident, and equally the same in relation to the green box for non-UK domiciles. And the third concept which drives tax is the source or sizes of the money that you're making. So income tax applies, it depends on whether you have UK source or non-UK source income for certain people. Same for capital gains and inheritance tax. Looking at that first blue box, if you are in my situation, which is I am UK domiciled and UK resident, but unfortunately there's a big tick there. I pay tax on everything, all my income, wherever it's made, all my capital gains, and I pay inheritance tax on my estate when I die. If I was to go non-resident, then I would take myself out of certain aspects of taxation in the UK. I'll still be liable for tax made, for income made in the UK. I wouldn't be liable for any capital gains made either in the UK or outside, but I would still be liable for inheritance tax. Non-UK domiciled individuals, and I'll come on to explain what that means, are in a much more beneficial position. If they're UK resident, they pay tax on UK source income and capital gains, but they don't pay it on foreign income and foreign gains, and that's remitted to the UK, and that means essentially brought to the UK to enjoy. They are liable for inheritance tax on UK-based assets, but not foreign assets. And if you're non-UK domiciled and non-UK resident, you essentially just pay tax on income generated in the UK. There can be some instances where you get treaty relief from that, and you also pay inheritance tax on UK cited assets. So that is the essence of the tax system in the UK. So let me just look at domicile. This is a common law concept in the UK. It's essentially the country which you regard as your permanent home. It's not the same as residence or nationality. I mean, you can be UK resident and UK national and be UK domicile, but the three things are distinct concepts. You take your domicile of origin from your father, assuming your parents were married. If your parents weren't married, then it's from your mother. And origin is that you always have a domicile of origin. So it's where was your father's domicile at the point of your birth. You can, however, displace that domicile of origin by acquiring a domicile of choice. Now that is quite difficult. It's very difficult to establish. What the UK revenue would expect to see is that you have absolutely, so if you're starting off as a UK domicile, that you've absolutely given up all intention to live in the UK, and that you've formed a settled residence in your new country of domicile and severed all your ties with the domicile of origin, with the UK. So domicile is very much where's your permanent home. It's a long-term concept, and it's very difficult to shift. It's very sticky, as we call it, very adhesive. And residence, again, the basics here, this is more about where you live year to year. You will be treated as UK resident if you are working full-time in the UK. In other cases, whether or not you're resident in the UK depends on the number of days you spend in the UK and the number of ties you have to the UK. And ties include things like having accommodation here, having family here, working for a certain number of days, more than 40 days in the UK. These are ties, and so if you have these ties, the more ties you have, the fewer days you can spend in the UK. And if you're someone who's never previously lived in the UK in the last 3 tax years, you're called an arriver, and you can be resident if you spend more than 45 days in the UK, depending on the number of ties, so you need to be careful at that point. You're always going to be treated as UK resident if you're in the UK for 183 days or more, so less than that you look to the ties. more than that, you are definitely a resident. So, I mentioned before, we're going to focus essentially in the first part of this on someone who is not a UK domiciliary, so someone who is Malaysian domicile, i.e. born to a Malaysian father, and essentially still sees Malaysia as their home. If you're investing in the UK, the good news is that the UK still has principally a tax haven status, although the way we go on in the press, you'll be quite surprised to hear that that's still around, because so many members of the media think it's outrageous that we do attract people to come and invest in the UK by creating a beneficial tax regime for them. But we still do have tax haven status. In fact, the tax position depends on the type of income that you have. Non-residents generally are not taxed on capital gains, and if you're coming to the UK as a non-domicile, you tend to be treated much more beneficially when it comes to comparison with a UK resident. So I'm going to focus on acquiring real estate. I mentioned at the beginning that many Malaysian investors in particular favour UK real estate. Large parts of central London appear to have been bought up or are being bought up by Malaysian investors. So I'm going to look at the tax issues that arise in relation to the acquisition of real estate. There are four broad taxes to consider as an individual investor. The first is stamp duty land tax. This is the transaction charge you pay on acquiring the property. The percentage depends on the value, but it goes up to 7% for properties worth more than £2 million. So that's the highest rate of stamp duty under the basic rules. As a non-resident, as I mentioned before, you don't pay any capital gains tax. So if you buy a property for £1 million and it rises in value to £1.5 million, you don't pay any tax on that gain when you come to sell it. Income tax is payable if you rent out the property. It's just 20%. It's on net profit, so you can deduct expenses, and also interest can be deducted from the rent, so you can put non-UK interest in there, set it up against the rent in order to effectively reduce or eliminate any income tax on the property. And the fourth tax to think about is inheritance tax. This is the thing that often troubles many people. We have very high rates of inheritance tax, 40%. You are given the first £325,000 of your estate tax-free. And the typical planning that's been done to avoid inheritance tax has been to hold UK real estate via an offshore company. And the reason why people do that is because your interest is then in the shares in the offshore company, and that is a non-UK asset. So if you're coming as a non-domiciliary Malaysian domicile to the UK, as I mentioned before, you only pay inheritance tax on UK citus assets. So you hold an offshore company, you don't have a UK citus asset that you should hold yourself, and companies are not liable to inheritance tax. So the offshore company, which does hold the UK asset, doesn't pay any inheritance tax. Companies can't die, I suppose, is the general principle there. There are, however, now special rules which apply to residential properties for your own occupation, which are worth more than £2 million if they're held via an offshore company. And these rules were introduced, some of them were introduced last year and the rest of them this April. And these rules are designed to just make it that bit more expensive, I suppose, to hold property by an offshore company. Let me look at those rules now. So, as I said, it applies to properties worth more than £2 million held by a non-natural person. That is typically a company. It can be a company who's part of a partnership, and also collective investments if there's a number of people holding it together. That's all treated as a non-natural person. So if you hold a residential property worth more than £2 million by one of these non-natural persons, you're into these new rules. The effect of those rules are stamp duty land tax when you acquire the property goes up to 15% from the 7% I mentioned before. So more than doubles the stamp duty, the cost of actually acquiring the property in the first place. You're also liable to an annual charge, which is between £15,000 a year and £140,000 a year depending on the value of the property. And I'll show you those bands in a second. You're also, for the first time, liable to capital gains tax. I mentioned before that non-resident owners of property in the UK don't pay capital gains tax. You do if you're holding it through an offshore company as a residential property worth more than 2 million, which is owner-occupied. And that's only on the gain made from the 1st of April 2013, or obviously when you bought the property, if you bought it later than that. But with all these extra taxes, you still do retain the IHT exemption, so you're still out of the inheritance tax risk of 40%. There are a number of exemptions to these special rules. The one of most interest is property which is let out commercially to an unconnected person does not fall within these rules. So even if it's a £2 million property, if it's let out and available to be let out, even if there's a void because you're waiting for a tenant, if it's available to be let out or let out, you're outside these rules and you're back to the basic rules that I've already mentioned. So that's the annual charge. Properties between 2 and 5 million, 15, between 5 million and 10 million is £35,000, 10 to 20 million, 70,000, and over 20 million is 140,000. And those rates are effectively anything between a quarter of a percent to 3/4% of the value of the property. So just to sort of summarise all that, if you're an Asian domiciliary, you're liable to IHT on UK real estate if you hold it directly. Typically people have enveloped into an offshore company, which therefore takes you out of IHT. That type of structuring still very much works if you're making a commercial investment, so you're investing either in commercial property, so not into the residential property rules at all, or it's residential property but you're letting it out on a commercial basis. Then you would almost always put it into a corporate structure to avoid that IHT risk, and there will be no downside in doing so. If you're holding property as a personal investment, your own occupation, i.e. it's a holiday home coming over to London, or you plan to live in the UK, then the question about whether or not you hold it through a corporate structure is a bit more difficult, and actually the decision will often depend on your precise facts. I'll try and bring some of those points out with a case study. Mr. Red is domiciled and resident in Malaysia.